Welcome to the Wisconsin Podcast. I'm Craig Sauer. On this podcast, we talk Wisconsin things, everything from sports, media, nature, politics, and more. Today's guest is Native American author and poet Louis Clark III. Clark was born and raised on the Oneida Reservation in northeastern Wisconsin. In his new book, How to Be an Indian in the 21st Century, the plainspoken writer discusses his coming face-to-face with prejudice in school and work, while also embracing his people's culture and traditions. His first chapbook, Two Shoes, was published in 2011. I talked with Clark by phone about his upbringing, his efforts to speak out against Native American sports mascot names, and his thoughts as a sports fan and as a man from a military family on recent protests by black football players about racial injustice. Maybe I should just start with the name of the book, How to Be an Indian in the 21st Century. It's a heck of a title. It catches people's attention. How did you come up with that title?
Well, actually, I was very lucky. I was asked to talk to the school board in the local area that has an Indian mascot. And that didn't go very well. But a few weeks later, someone who was at the school board meeting called, and they were sending, it was a church, and they were sending a group of students out to work on a reservation, and they wanted me to come and speak with them and tell them how my life was and what it's like being an Indian so they could fit in when they went out there. And so I went out, and it was probably the most electrifying time of my life because talking to those students, they were all high school students. I gave a 45-minute presentation, and they asked questions. They kept me there for 2.5 hours, and they literally followed me to the door asking questions. It was the most wonderful time. And from that, one of the mothers called me and asked me if I would come and give another presentation, but she said, "What is the name of your speech?" And basically, I just came up with How to Be an Indian in the 21st Century, and it worked.
It's an interesting title, not only that for that reason, but also I think if you go back in the first half of the 20th century, the kind of American government's approach to Native Americans was assimilation. And I think the idea was there wouldn't be Indians around in the 21st century. So it also works on that level as well.
Yeah, it does work. It was a gift from the Creator, I'm sure, because my parents lived through that time, and they knew what it was like to try to be white in the red world, or nobody wanted to be an Indian, especially during the Cold War. Nobody really wanted to be considered red, even though because the Reds were the Russians, and so there was a stigma attached to the whole thing, and it wasn't until the mid-1960s, 1968 actually, I believe, when the great presidential race with Bobby Kennedy and Wallace and Johnson and Nixon, and the Indians started to come to life again and seeking their freedom. I remember sitting at the hamburger stand in Oneida. There was a hamburger stand there, and there was a young Indian boy there from out west, and he had hair down to his waist, and he had the white T-shirt with the Marlboro pack rolled up in the sleeves and a black belt and black bell bottoms, and he was playing the pinball machine, and he just looked like that's what every young Indian wanted to look like at that time, and things started to change in '68, and that's when I started writing poetry.
Before we get too far along, maybe I'll have you read a poem if you have your book handy. If you wanted to maybe read a poem from your new book to get us started talking.
Yeah, basically this is a poem that I wrote that encapsulates much of what the book says. It's called "I'm an Indian," I think, and I'll just read a part of it. But it goes, "I'm an Indian, yes I am. I'm an Indian man. I'm an Indian, yes I am. I'm an Indian, I think. born and raised on the reservation. I got corn soup in my veins. Had fried bread at my graduation, but I think it kind of strange. I don't look like what I see when you say you're honoring me. I'm an Indian, yes I am. I'm an Indian, I think. And that's part of my poem that pretty much says the whole thing about the book. You know, it kind of assimilates the whole perspective of the book that where I'm an Indian, but not the kind of Indians that is presented to society nowadays.
And now take me back to the late '60s there, and you start writing poetry. Why did you originally start writing poetry, and what did it start to mean to you over time?
Well, when I first started writing poetry, I think it was '68. I was 12 years old. I had been through a lot growing up. You know, if anybody ever wanted to get in a fight, they call you a stupid Indian. That's how you learned you were. A lot of my cousins, that's how we learned that we were Indians. Somebody was hitting on our chests, hitting us in the face, calling us a stupid Indian. And because nobody tells you you're an Indian. And so there had to be some way to release aggressions without having to always fight. And so I started writing poetry because I liked the cadence of the poetry of the time. I remember the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, the One If by Land, Two If by Sea, and I on the Opposite Shore Shall Be. And so that started me out, and then I started listening to some Tommy Boyce and Bobby Hart poetry. They wrote most of the songs for the Monkees, and I just like the cadence, and I like to be able to get what was inside of me out without having to share it with the public. And so I started writing poetry. But if you write poetry when you're in sixth grade, you get beat up even more. That was the start. And I just started writing poetry and started writing, and little by little I just kept writing. And going to high school was rough. You know, you get beat up a lot. But there was one teacher, Bruce Sanders, and I haven't been able to keep in contact with him. I hope that someday he sees the book, because I did mention him in it. And but he just told me I could write, and he told me I could do a lot of things. So, you know, having a teacher believe in you, and then I met my wife in high school, and she always believed in me, and so she always backed me in my writing. It wasn't anything big, you know. Sure, as a youth, you have those dreams of maybe making it big and doing something great, but it started to be that I just wrote for me. I just wrote because it made me feel good, and you know, and I enjoyed it. And in 1979, I actually wrote a book similar to this, and I let a teacher read it at UW Oshkosh, and they pretty much said that if it's worth doing like that, somebody's already doing it. So I kind of got shot down there. So I just imploded, I guess you would say, and I just kept everything inside me and just used it and let my writing be, and didn't share it with anybody really.
But eventually, it did find its way out into the world, and how did the process come out again? How did you kind of bring it to the public again? And it's kind of interesting because later in life, you got published, and it's kind of go ahead.
Well, what happened with me? I was writing. My wife and I, we coached Little League baseball for 19 years, and we ran the program here in Amro for a couple of years. I was the president of the Amro Baseball Association. And what happened is that we would write stories for the newspaper for all the kids and make sure we had every kid's name mentioned at least once during the year. And we had like 60 to 100 kids in the program every year. And so we have the coaches report to us at least one good thing they did and that kind of stuff. And so we just started writing more. And then finally, because of the union, I was able to work my way up into a foreman's job where we were installing culverts in roadways. And my thought process was that everybody wants to be remembered for what they did. So I started sharing my poetry with my men, my crew, and what we would do is we would take one of my poems and we would write our names on it and what we did on the project, and then we would seal it in plastic and attach it to the outside of the culverts when we installed them, and then maybe 50 to 100 years from now when they dig them up, maybe they'll see who did the project and will be remembered. So that's how I started sharing my poetry.
And then how did the book deal come along?
Well, in 2010, I was reading the newspaper, and there was an ad in the paper, and it said, "Send if you are a poet or a writer, send some samples to X address." And it didn't say send any money, so I thought, oh, what the heck, right? So I did, and a few weeks later, I got a letter, "Would you send us 5 more?" And it still didn't say send any money, so I thought, oh, okay. So I sent 5 more. And then one afternoon, one evening, there was a phone call from a Mr. James Perrins, who was the grandson of Judge Perrins, the Packer president. And he was in charge of the English department at the University of Arkansas at Little Rock. And he said that he read my poetry, and he was wondering if I could send him 35 to 40 poems. And so he received some type of grant from the Sequoia National Research Center to publish a chapbook. He wanted to take my poems to the publishing board and maybe have a chapbook printed for me. So I did, and they didn't ask for any money, which was the bottom line, I guess. And then they came back and said they wanted to publish a chapbook for me and that I would get 1,000 copies. And I said, "What's the catch?" And he said, "The catch is that you have to go out and share your poetry." And that's pretty hard to go up and stand in front of a group of people and share what's deep inside you. But, I mean, so I did. And I started just doing little 20-minute talks, maybe only 2 poems, and they have little poem gatherings all over the state, and I go and just do my 2 poems, and people were nice about it. And then Oshkosh has a writers group at the library, Oshkosh Writers Club, and they put on a literary conference every year. And one day, as it was, I'm like Carlton the doorman. I just help people in and out and do those type of things. But I was sitting at the table where the people register, and Ruth, the person who runs the conference, just came down, and you could tell something was wrong because her hair was like Don King's hair, standing straight up, you know. I said, "What's wrong?" And she just looked at me and said, "Can you talk for an hour?" I said, "Well, of course I can talk for an hour." So one of her speakers had an emergency and had to leave. So I went and I gave an hour talk. And then I was getting a few more invitations to give an hour talk. And then the Wisconsin Fellowships of Poetry had their annual conference, and they invited me to give a talk. And I'm not a member yet, but I hope to soon be a member. And so I went and I gave a talk, and one of their membership came and said, "Why don't you put that talk into a book form?" Kind of like, I don't know if you remember Leo Buscaglia from the 1980s and 90s. He would give talks, and his books reflected his talks. So I kind of went with that idea, and I put this book into my speech, basically, into the book form, and sent it down to the Wisconsin Historical Society. And, well, there's an aside to this. During this time, one of the men who worked with me got for me Paul Horning's autograph. I don't know if you're old enough to remember who Paul Horning is.
Of course, yep. Packer.
Oh, you do good. The great Packer
of course.
Running back.
Yep.
176 points in the 1960 season, et cetera, Hall of Famer. Well, anyway, I sent him a thank you note, and he called me. And I said to him, "Why didn't anybody ever write a book about that season?" And it's basically because the Packers didn't win a championship or anything. But he says, "Why don't you write the book?" And so I did, and I sent both the books down to Madison. They called me down there, and they were very nice. the ride down there was eventful for the fact that we have a GPS on our car. And when I got down to the end of State Street, we were doing crossing State Street. And right at the end, the lady in the GPS said, turn right. And I did, and I ended up being right on the sidewalk, driving down the sidewalk of UW-Madison, it looked like. And everybody's very liberal there, so they're waving at us, and we just got out of the way. But she took us right to our parking space that was reserved for us. And we went into the building, and they were very nice to us. And they turned down the Packer book, and then they said, and we don't even accept manuscripts like How to Be an Indian in the 21st Century. Was, what do you say, When I first joined the writers group, they said that it was a major thing if you had got a personalized letter as a rejection sheet slip, for something sent in. But here I got called all the way down to Madison face to face to be rejected. I didn't know how to take it. And then they said, but we read your book, and it says something, we can hear your voice, and it's very unique, and we think it says something, so we'd like to publish it as a memoir in prose and poetry. And so I said, would I be excited? And they said, yeah, you should be excited. And then Kathy, the head person, though, winked at me and said, I won't quit my day job yet, though. So.
Well, yeah, and people should definitely check out the book. I don't think I've ever read a book like it before, in the sense that it is like a memoir, but it is in poetry and prose, and it's like very, really like you have kind of like a very unique voice. Can you maybe describe a little bit how you approach writing, and how would you describe your poetry style?
Okay, well, this is how I would describe it totally, is because I think I'm attempting, in my mind, to keep alive the oral traditions of my people. And I think that when you're keeping stories alive, it's easier to remember them if they have a cadence or if they have a rhyming scheme. And I grew up before TV was a big thing. We had TV when I was young, but that was pretty much just as a babysitter. When people actually would come over and sit at the kitchen table and spend the evening just talking, telling stories. Through the blue haze of the smoke and the beer on the table, it was stories. And that's how I started to incorporate that. Langston Hughes, the great black poet, always tried to write in a blues cadence. And I remember when I was a real little kid, my father took me to the powwow, and it was a real powwow, grassroots powwow, where people dragged logs from the woods and sat on the logs and had real campfires and teepees and tents, and there were trailers, and there were 3 drums by the home plate. It was on the baseball diamond, and those drums, and they weren't the white drums that you hear on TV that go boom, 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 boom. No, these were a steady beat, and it sounded like your heartbeat. And I remember laying in bed as a little kid, and you could hear those drums, and I just felt secure. Mm-hmm. And so that's what I try to incorporate into my writing. That's what makes me feel good. And I think the thing that makes the book work is that it's honest. It was never meant, to try to sell. It was meant for me to talk to people with. And that's why I think it's successful.
Now's probably a good time to maybe tell, you start out the book talking a little bit about your childhood and your parents. Maybe tell us a little bit about your household growing up, and what your heritage is, and tell me a little bit about your mom and dad.
Okay, I'm Oneida, born and raised on the reservation up by Green Bay. We're of the Iroquois Confederacy, the Haudenosaunee, that means people of the Longhouse. I'm of the Bear Clan. I believe that the Bear Clan incorporates the people, the artists, and the storytellers. And I grew up, I was, I guess you would call it the oops of the family, because my youngest sister was 8 years older than I was. we grew up basically right on the reservation. I was lucky to grow up there. And my mom was a very artistic person. In the 1940s, she won a art contest, and Eleanor Roosevelt, the president's wife, came and gave her an award. And then she also played baseball. And she always said she played baseball, not softball. So she said she played baseball all over the Midwest at the end of the war. And so my thinking has always been it was something like a league of your own. But then, like most of the women of the time, when the men came back from the war, she was pushed to the back of the bus. And being an Indian and being a woman, her chances for advancement were very limited. My father came back from the war. He was in the Navy, but he was on merchant marine ships for most of World War II. And he died in 1992, and last 2 years ago, we got his war records. My daughter was in Afghanistan. When she came back, she worked for veterans for a little while and was able to get his war records. And he had qualified for the Bronze Star, and he never told anybody. My dad's main motto was, if you're warm and your belly is full, then everything else is a piece of cake. So basically that's how I was raised. However, in the 60s, you take a strong woman like my mother, and my father was a strong man, but I'm sure he had nightmares from the wars because he was in Korea also. And you add some alcohol and the revolutionary ideas of the 60s, and there was a lot of turmoil, with alcohol and alcoholism. And I was raised in that environment, and so you don't do real good in that environment, because when I went to high school, a teacher took me aside and told me that I didn't have to study. All I had to do was keep my mouth shut, and I would graduate. So I didn't really learn too much in high school, but I did meet my wife, which was wonderful. And after a few years of being married, and we were quite successful when we first got married. We were making lots of money, full-time job, many jobs actually. And we said, is this the type of life that we want our children to have? And we sat down, and we didn't see any barriers in life. We thought we could overcome anything. And so we basically ran away from home, Green Bay, and we came to Oshkosh, and I started school. And it took 25 years of night school to get my degree, but I did obtain my degree, and now all 6 of our children have obtained their degrees, and my wife is a freshman in college now, so that's very honoring for us. So,
talk to me a little bit about raising your kids. You said you didn't necessarily grow up in the best environment, in the best household. I know you write lovingly about your parents, but there was, you note some problems with alcohol. Talk to me a little bit about raising your own kids when you didn't necessarily have the best upbringing in your life.
Well, what we did was we looked to the future. We tried to see, in the Indian tradition, you're supposed to look 7 generations ahead, which basically means look at what you do today, how it will affect tomorrow. And my wife and I, we studied and we did our reading and that kind of stuff, and we bought into that idea. So we tried to raise our kids with an eye on what we would like them to achieve. And my wife was wonderful. She would tuck the kids in every night, and this might sound a little bit harsh, but she would tuck them in with closed mouth and open ears. She would let them talk to her. She would listen. She wouldn't make any judgments. And we're a very close-knit family, so we're very lucky. My 4 sons all were lucky enough to go to Lawrence University right here in Appleton, which is quite prestigious for us and traditional, because the first 5 of the first 38 students at Lawrence in 1848 were Oneidas. So there was a tie there, so that was wonderful for us. And our daughters, they went to different schools, because it's hard being if it's all boys playing baseball and that stuff, it's hard to be known as just the Clark girls or the Clark this, So the girls wanted a little bit more freedom, and they went to different schools, and they both succeeded quite well.
I assume your kids have, read your book. What do they make of you as a poet?
They're my biggest backers. Back when I still had the dreams of being a serious poet, they collected all their, they were just young kids, but they always knew I wrote. And they collected all their allowance money and that kind of stuff, and there was a gathering of poets up in Oneida. And they got their money together, and that was my Christmas present, that I was allowed to go spend a week there with all these poets. And so they were just wonderful to us, to me and my wife. And when I went there and I saw how much pain that poets were sharing, I said, yeah, I have the same pain, but man, I've had such a wonderful life. I like to sit back and think of the wonderful things I have instead of worrying about the things that I don't have. It seems funny, but I think for me personally, indoor plumbing and hot water are such a magnificent thing. I mean, that's basic. If I have that, I'm happy. And so when I got done, I said, I'm just going to write what I feel and not worry about anybody else. I'm going to just break the rules. I had gone to college. In college, I took poetry classes, and I knew the rules, and I knew how you're supposed to try to write metaphorically and show people, draw pictures. And I said, no, yes, I can do that, but I want to write just how I feel, and I want to be the oral tradition, the cadence of my people. And I want to try to carry on what I didn't have a chance to have carried on to me because the government was trying to assimilate my parents into the white world.
One of the things you write about in the book is your appearance. You write that you have blue eyes and you don't necessarily look Native American.
No. Well, I do. I mean, I don't look like a traditional Native American. No, I don't have well, I have a big nose, but it's more wider. and I don't have feathers. And so, if the cover of the book pretty much speaks it out, where in the 2010, do you like the cover of the book?
I do, yeah. It's very stark.
I designed it.
Oh, did you really?
Yeah, they fixed it up a little bit because I had actually had a different kind of Indian. I had Oneida, what I thought was an Oneida Indian with only 2 feathers, but this looks better. But yeah, that was basically my design, so I'm kind of proud of that because my mom was an artist, and I was lucky enough that they took my idea.
So you read about kind of some of this interesting, interactions with people who maybe don't necessarily know you're an Indian or you don't necessarily project that sometimes. But you also write about the racism that you did encounter throughout your life, in work and just in life in general. And I'm wondering how you dealt with that just as a person, and then how did you deal with that in your writing?
Well, I think I'm a little bit more raw in my writings because I think I'm letting out what I really feel in my writings. But in my personal life, I understand that we're all human and we all, can I say victims of our upbringing? Because I had one gentleman who was my boss a long time ago, and he was like one of the greatest people on earth, but he could not get over me being Indian. He'd nothing overt, but there was just a tension there all the time, and there shouldn't have been. And, you can just feel it. And I tried to be friends, and we were friends. We were, but it was just the tension. And so maybe I'd let those feelings come out in my writing where I wouldn't confront him, because he was trying, and his upbringing just said that we were different, and he was and it's hard. I mean, anybody different, and it doesn't have to be an Indian. It doesn't have to be a black person. It can be anybody different, and it works that way. People treat them different.
Hmm. You write in the book, and you mentioned earlier that you got involved with the public discourse about race-based mascots at schools.
Yeah.
Can you tell? And I think you write in the book that you had kids who were playing sports in high school or college, and they would play against, a school with a Native American mascot as like their team name. What was that like, and why was it so important for you to kind of speak out against it?
Well, initially, when I ran away from the reservation, I tried to shelter my kids from all of that. I didn't want them to have to experience anything that I experienced that way. I guess I was just like the mother goose. And but you can't shelter them, because I remember we were at a basketball game and the team had an Indian name, and off in the corner they were doing the tomahawk chop, and they're doing the hey, 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 that type of stuff. And there was a couple kids dressed like Indians, and I was just thinking, boy, this is the thing that I didn't want my kids to have to face. Fortunately, my kids, all of them were very successful sport-wise, and we could, overlook it because we were winning, or we were not close or attempting to win, and so we never really dealt with it. But then after a while, some people would come and ask me to deal with it, and I was called down to Madison to testify, and I received some bad personal rejections from people that I didn't think would treat me that way. But that's life. I forgive them. I'd still be friends with them. It's just, it's just ignorance. I feel it's just personal ignorance to think somebody's different because they're from a different race. And hopefully, if they read this book, they'll see that we're really not different. We're unique, but we're not different. We're basically all the same, and so we shouldn't be having these divides, especially in a country like ours.
What was kind of the pushback that you received from when you were speaking out against these names? I think the kids that you saw dressing up as an Indian, they maybe didn't understand.
Right.
They were, it's just like, well, it's our nickname. It's been this nickname for 30, 40, 50 years. And they just don't, maybe recognize that it's hurting somebody. And I think maybe their parents are like, well, it's just tradition. And why would you want to change tradition? What were
Right.
some of the, like, how did you react when people said things like that to you?
I went to the pen. I wrote a letter to the Oshkosh Northwestern initially, speaking my mind about what I thought the mascot encompassed, the mascot issue, and how I didn't think it was right. And so this is going to sound kind of spiritual, but I was working and I was down the ditch and I found a book, and the name of the book, it was in the ditch. It's called Rethinking Columbus, and it was even a used edition. And I read that, and it really opened my mind. It gave different facts about a different history than that we were raised with. And so I did write a letter to the Northwestern, and when the Oshkosh West was debating whether to change their symbol, and then at the end, the Oshkosh Northwestern asked me again to write a letter, and I did receive 2 death threats, that I should be killed and that type of stuff. So that was, you didn't take it seriously. I guess at the time you wore it as a badge of honor because it must be hidden pretty close. The truth. That's what I felt. And then I did get called down to Madison, and I did testify. And I think I lost a few friends, but you can't. You have to speak the truth, or at least what your version of the truth is.
It why are, you mentioned getting death threats and losing some friends over this. I mean, why is it such? I mean, it's just a mascot. It's just a name. Why, why do you think certain people on the other side of that issue are so attached or like dig in so much regarding the name? And you see this with like the Washington NFL franchise and, in the Cleveland baseball team. Why does the other side dig in so much on just a nickname, on a mascot? Why do you think it's so important to the other side?
I really don't know. I really wish I could figure that out, because I think that if you look at things and take other people's feelings into consideration and look, like the term redskin, where does the term redskin come from? But in 1653, when the New England Train Company put bounties out on our people, and to prove that you killed an Indian, you brought a piece of their hair with red skin attached to it. And that's how the term redskin came into vogue. And so, if you really looked at that type of stuff, there's no honor in that. And so it's education, and I think it's all about education, and that's why my family pushes education so strongly. And, it's hard being an Indian when you say you're pushing education, because most of society says, yes, Indians get all free education. Well, it doesn't happen. We did get a little help. I got some help, but because of the structure of the federal government saying that my great-grandmother was shipped off to Carlisle University, Pennsylvania, the Indian school, where she met my great-grandfather, who was of a different tribe. So I'm, 3/8 Oneida and 1/8 Chippewa, which means my children are 3/16 Oneida and 1/16 Chippewa. So they don't qualify for any help for college. So they did everything on their own, and I'm so proud of them. And so it's all about education and working and striving to be your best and striving to do things. And so that we were lucky that my wife brought that feeling into our family of how to be working all the time. And I had the dreams of education, and together we formed a pretty good team, and the kids all accomplished. And then when they get to be adults, then we try to give them a foundation. When they became adults, they're allowed, then they can fly. If you give them a good foundation, they can fly.
Since you're a sports fan, and I wanted to get your opinion of the talk of sports right now, which is, African American players kneeling during the national anthem. And I thought you might have an interesting perspective on this because, I mean, as a Native American, obviously the country hasn't always been that great for your people, but at the same time, you are American, and you have had family members serve in the military. And I'm just kind of like wondering what's kind of going through your head on Sundays when you see these protests, and just what is your reaction to it?
Well, a short history is that we can trace our involvement in American wars all the way back to the Revolutionary War, where one of our relatives was Honorary Dockstader, and he was a captain in the Union in the American Revolution for fighting for the Americas. And then through pretty much we've served in every war since then, or had somebody in the family fight. And my daughter went to Afghanistan. My father was in Korea in World War II. Nixon didn't want me in Vietnam, so he quit the draft. And but so yeah, I mean, I remember seeing a tear come down my father's face while he sang the national anthem, and we're very proud of everything. But again, as I said, education and knowledge is the key. I read this wonderful article about Colin Kaepernick, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, from the San Francisco 49ers, and was like a 3-page spread in the New York Times. And it explained why he did what he did. And it was very thoughtful, and it was very well received by his other members of his team. And that's why we fight these wars, to give people the freedom to choose to do those things. I mean, if we made everybody stand, would we be any better than one of these dictators where they make people do things? No, we fought so people have the freedom to do that. Whether I think it's right or wrong, that really shouldn't matter. It's what did we fight for as a country to give people freedom to make their own choices? I guess that's where I stand on that.
So I kind of wanted to ask you a little bit about baseball. I love baseball myself. I still try to play on the weekends in my life, and I grew up playing. And I'm just kind of curious, like, what did sports mean in your life, and maybe baseball specifically?
Okay, what we did is we had to decide. I didn't have a really good upbringing as a child, so I really didn't know. I used to watch Leave It to Beaver and the Brady Bunch and try to see how families reacted. So I really didn't have that. So my wife and I had to make decisions on how to raise the kids, and the kids wanted to play sports. So if you want to play sports, you have to do good in school. And so we used sports as a way to raise our families. And so my wife and I got involved in baseball in 1988. And our oldest son, just this year, he works for the University of Minnesota, called his mother and said, Mom, they're doing a survey here, and they want to know what type of vacations that we used to have when we were young. And he said, I don't remember ever going on vacation. And my wife says to him, she says, your dad didn't think we needed vacations because we got to play baseball all summer, and that was our vacation. So, and that was true. That's what we did. We played baseball all over and all summer. And we had a really good program, my wife and I developed, where our team, we would have 15 players on our Little League team, and we played with 10 players in the outfield. So you take 15 times the number of innings, you take 10 positions times number of innings, that's so you have 60 positions, 60 innings of play. So we divide that by 15, so every one of our ball players would get 4 innings of play, and they had to play every position except catcher, because when you're working with 9 through 12-year-old kids, some kids aren't ready to play catcher. But in the last 6 years that we coached, that's how we did it, and we won 2 championships, actually 3 championships. The kids bought into that system because they were all treated equal, and they were all out there to make memories. And we lost a lot of games, but we won a lot of games, and we had fun. We played baseball all the time, and then we're Cubs fans, so we lived and died with the Cubs, and I think that's what we did. We just let baseball and sports help us raise our family. I have to admit, now that the kids are gone, I don't live and die and watch as much sports as we did then, because now I do more reading and that type of stuff. But it really did help us raise the family. Oh, and I'd like to let you know that the first book, won an Oneida Art Sport Award. So that was really wonderful for us, that gave us the impetus to keep writing. And now I was just found out just before you called that this book has won an Oneida Fellowship Award.
Oh, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It's just, I am so humbled by the whole experience. It's so wonderful that people are seeing this, and maybe I'm opening some eyes. Maybe the book is making a statement, and that's what we hope to do. And then wonderful people like you interview and put it out on the radio.
Yeah. It sounds to me as I'm talking to you, it seems like poetry to you was what maybe sports was to your kids when growing up. Maybe like poetry and writing helped to raise you a little bit, since you didn't necessarily have, ideal parents growing up.
Right. I believe so, yeah. And my kids looked for it. But what I do, and so you're still playing, I never really played baseball. I played 1965 I played, but I never got a hit. And then when I turned 55, I got to play one game with my youngest son. He played for an adult team. But I still pitch whenever I can. I have it set up in the backyard. I have a 45-foot mound with a 12-inch strike zone, and I throw 50 balls a day when I can, and I keep score on it. That's how I exercise.
I love it.
And baseball has meant a lot to our family. My youngest son still coaches up in Sevastopol.
Oh, cool.
So, sports has been the tie that's always bound us together.
Oh, that's great. I'm wondering if you could maybe read another poem that would maybe sum up our conversation a little bit.
Okay, this is a poem that a lot of people ask me to read. It's the last poem of the book, and it's called I Am Torn. Between the wilderness of my youth and the white world we call civilization. Torn between the freedom of the fields and the fight for human dignity, between the false comfort of an apathetic attitude and the calamities inherent in having empathy for my brothers and sisters of all nations. I am torn between the false security promoted by technologies that leave us fat and swollen upon the couches of our homes, and the savage need to rebel against an authority that fails to abide by the very laws they are sworn to uphold. Between the urge to close my eyes to hide away from the injustices of the world, and the desire to plant the seeds of freedom, of justice, to watch them bloom. Please, Lord, grant me the wisdom to overcome the conflicts of my humanity, and the courage to make my life meaningful.
That was a real pleasure. Make sure to check out Louis' book, How to Be an Indian in the 21st Century. You can meet him at the upcoming Wisconsin Book Festival in Madison on November 4th. If you're listening to this show via Apple Podcast, please, I'd love it if you give us a review or a rating. It helps spread the word about the show. In addition to subscribing to the podcast on iTunes, you can also subscribe to the podcast on Stitcher, Google Play, and a few other places. Or you can stream the show at whizpod.com. Cheers.